I am 92 years old. My skin is a map of nearly a century's worth of winters, and my hands, once steady enough to build an empire, now tremble like autumn leaves in a drafty room. But today, I want to take you back to a day when those hands were gripped white-knuckled around the steering wheel, guided by a heart that had forgotten how to beat for anything but fear. I want to tell you about the day I almost ended my life. Not as a metaphor, not as a cry for attention, but as a cold, calculated exit strategy. I stood on the precipice of the great beyond, and decided the world would be a quieter, better place if my seat at the table was left vacant. I'm sharing this because if you've ever felt that darkness, that thick, cloying surge that fills your lungs until every breath feels like inhaling shards of glass, I need you to know I have walked that valley. I have tasted the metallic tang of despair. And more importantly, I need you to understand why I wake up every morning now, nearly 4 decades later, and offer a silent prayer of thanks to a man whose name I barely remember, and a life I almost threw away. The truth was, I was a ghost haunting a gilded cage. My business wasn't just failing, it was hemorrhaging. I had played the game of high-stakes development and lost. I had trusted silver-tongued partners who vanished like smoke when the interest rate spiked. I had expanded into territories I didn't understand, borrowing against a future that was rapidly evaporating. Every morning, I woke to the sound of my own pulse drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A knot of panic so tight, it felt like a physical tumor in my chest. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, performing a macabre dance of mathematics in my head, trying to figure out which lie would cover which debt, knowing the entire house of cards was one gust of wind away from a catastrophic collapse. At home, the silence was louder than any shouting match. Eleanor and I were like two ships passing in a fog. Our only communication the dull clink of silverware against china during dinners when no one tasted the food. I had retreated into a fortress of my own making, convinced that my failure as a provider made me a failure as a man. I looked at Eleanor, beautiful, patient Eleanor, and saw only a victim of my incompetence. I told myself she'd be better off with the life insurance payout. I convinced myself that my death would be my final, most successful business transaction, trading a broken man for a debt-free future. I called it noble. In reality, I was just too exhausted to fight the shadows anymore. My children, Sarah and Thomas, were strangers who shared my last name. Sarah was 20, a woman grown, looking at me with eyes that held 1,000 unasked questions. Thomas was 17, a boy on the verge of manhood, who had learned that silence was the safest way to interact with a father who was always busy. I had become a phantom who paid the bills and occupied a chair, but offered no warmth, no guidance. I told myself they would be relieved when the Great Frank was finally out of their way, no longer a disappointment taking up oxygen. By the morning of February 14th, the erosion was complete. You see, the end rarely comes as a sudden thunderclap. It's a slow, rhythmic dripping that wears away the stone of your resolve. First comes the crack, then the fissure, then the chasm. I had been falling into that chasm for months, and by that cold February dawn, the bottom looked less like a tragedy and more like a soft bed. I wrote the letters. My pen felt heavy, the ink bleeding into the paper like tears. I told them I was sorry. I told them they were better off. I folded them with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, and tucked them into the top drawer of my mahogany desk. At 6 in the morning, while the world was still draped in the bruised purple of pre-dawn, I slipped out. The air was biting, a frost that turned my breath into ghostly plumes. I drove. The heater in my car hummed a low, mournful tune as I watched the familiar landmarks of my life recede in the rearview mirror. The sky was a flat, oppressive gray, the color of white concrete, drained of all vibrancy. I found myself at a nondescript overpass on a forgotten stretch of highway, 40 miles from the life I was abandoning. I parked on the gravel shoulder. The wind howled through the steel girders of the bridge, a desolate, lonely sound that echoed the emptiness in my gut. It was freezing, the kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, but sinks into your marrow. I walked to the railing. The metal was slick with ice, biting into my palms with a cool, rhythmic sting. I looked down. The drop was significant, ending in a river that ran dark and fast, swollen with winter rain, and indifferent to the dramas of men. I closed my eyes and whispered, "This is it. This is how the story ends. Hey, you okay?" The voice was gravelly, unexpected, and entirely too close. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing a few yards away was a man who looked like he had been forged in the very shadows I was trying to join. He was young, maybe 30, wearing a jacket that had seen too many winters and jeans that were frayed at the hems. His face was a map of hardship, weathered by the sun and scarred by the street, but his eyes were sharp, piercing through the fog of my despair. He held a plastic bag that crinkled in the wind, likely containing everything he owned. I stammered the lie we all tell when we're breaking. "I'm fine." He didn't move. He didn't look away. "You don't look fine," he said, his voice steady against the wind. "You look like a man who's about to make a very permanent mistake for a very temporary reason." I let out a laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "What do you know about it?" I spat. He shrugged, a slow, deliberate movement. "I know because 3 years ago, I was looking at the water from a different bridge. Same cold, Frank. Same duck." The fact that he used my name, even though he didn't know it, jolted me. He sat down right there on the curb, his back to the traffic, as if we were just two friends waiting for a bus. "What stopped you?" I asked, the words barely a whisper. He smiled, and was the saddest, most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. "A dog," he said, "a scrawny, three-legged stray." He sat down next to me and licked my hand, and I thought, if this creature thinks I'm worth a moment of his time, maybe the universe isn't done with me yet. He chuckled. "Stupid, right? Saved by a mutt." But it wasn't stupid. It was the smallness of it that hit me. It was a tether to the world of the living. I found my legs giving way, and I sat down next to him, the freezing concrete leaching the heat from my body. We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the occasional whoosh of a distant truck. "I'm Danny," he finally said, "and you look like you've got a lot of heavy lifting to do, Frank." For the next 2 hours, I unburdened myself. I told the stranger things I hadn't even whispered to my own reflection. I told him about the debts, the failing pride, the way my children looked through me. Danny didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell me it would be easy. He just listened, his presence a warm hearth in the middle of a blizzard. When I was finished, he looked at me and said, "You can endure the jump, Frank, but you can endure a bad business deal. You can fix a broken neck, but you can fix a broken heart. It just takes more work than dying does." He stood up and offered me a hand with dirt under the nails and calluses earned from a life of struggle. "Come on," he said, There's a diner 2 miles up. The coffee is terrible, but the heater works. I took his hand. It was the first time in years I felt like I wasn't falling. We sat in a cracked vinyl booth, the smell of burnt grease and cheap tobacco filling the air. Danny paid for the coffee with a handful of sticky nickels and dimes. We talked until the sun finally broke through the gray, casting long golden fingers across the linoleum floor. The problems were still there, but the bridge was behind me. When I finally drove back into my driveway, the world looked different. The colors were sharper. I walked into the kitchen, where Eleanor was standing by the stove, her face a mask of terror. I didn't make an excuse. I didn't retreat. I walked up to her, took her hands, which were shaking as much as mine, and I told her everything. I told her about the bridge. I told her about the letters. I expected her to leave, to scream, to recoil. Instead, she pulled me into an embrace so fierce I thought my ribs might crack. "Frank," she sobbed into my chest. "I don't need the house. I don't need the money. I just need you to come home." The years that followed were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. We lost the business, we lost the colonial home and the beeswax-scented rooms. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment where the neighbors play loud music and the elevator always smelled of onions. I took a job as a safe foreman, working for men 20 years my junior. It was humbling, it was exhausting, and it was glorious. Because for the first time, I was present, I was honest. I learned that my value wasn't in my bank account, but in the way I listened to Thomas's dreams, and the way I held Sarah's hand when she was scared. I am 92 years old now. If I had jumped that morning in 1984, I would have missed 38 years of a life I didn't know was possible. I would have missed the smell of the jasmine in the garden of our small apartment. I would have missed the sound of Sarah's laughter as she walked down the aisle. I would have missed the weight of my granddaughter Amma in my arms, a child who has Eleanor's eyes and my stubborn streak. I would have missed the quiet, soft conversations Eleanor and I had in the dark of our old age, realizing that we had built something far more permanent than a skyscraper. If you are standing on your own bridge today, whether it's a literal railing or a metaphorical edge, please listen to an old man who has been there. The darkness is a liar. It tells you that the pain is eternal and that your absence is a gift. It's not. The pain is a season, and seasons change. If you make a permanent choice, you are robbing the world of the person you are meant to become. You are robbing yourself of the laughter you haven't heard yet, and the sunrises you haven't seen. I never saw Danny again. I don't know if he was an angel or just a man who knew when to stop. But his one act of kindness saved an entire lineage. It saved a husband, a father, and a grandfather. It only takes one person to stop. It only takes one moment to choose life. If you're hurting, call out, reach out, sit on the curb with a stranger. Just don't let go, because the view from 92 is beautiful, and I want you to see it for yourself. So I ask you this. If you could go back and tell your youngest, most hurting self one thing about the future, what would it be? Let's talk about it in the comments. Your story might be the bridge someone else needs to cross today.